skateboard places. Any local paper, you can see that they are showing that there is a new pedestrian path or bike lane. But is this what makes Lihula into Lihula, or is it the historical heritage or the community which makes Lihula into Lihula? So asking the community, what do they value? What are the important landmarks in every place? I think that's the main question. We are protecting 13,500 memorials, either constructions or other important landmarks, but we actually protecting less than 1% of what has ever been built. So that means 0.11% of the Estonian total area would be covered by archaeological heritage, and we are rich enough to cope with our own heritage if we dedicate ourselves to it. And national is always local as well. So if something is under a state protection as a heritage, it doesn't mean that the local community can say that it doesn't matter, you do that. So the heritage is something which concerns all of us. It's an important point of the identity and what is distinct in your area, and that can be basis of the success. It's also part of the green transition. So before we even talked about green transition, because the most cost saving is to live where people have lived before us, and it's also part of diversity and what makes this place worthy of living. We talk about cultural diversity. So there are many big things which we cannot do alone. We can only work as a community and in cooperation, for example, to create an identity or carry on forward to the next generation the cultural memory. So that means we need to have certain agreements. And in order for the old towns to survive, the communities and local talents have to have a possibility to implement their ideas. So not all their ideas have to come from the city council. They can also come from the population. So what the many local governments prepare the general plans, they look what is the commonality, what makes us into us, where do we agree. Then I think that this complicated diversity as we are today, then we don't really get a good result. Where we get a good result is we look for dedication. So we look for people who dedicate themselves to the cultural heritage, and we try to find these people for whom it is important to promote their community. And how many people are dedicated to the valuing the cultural heritage, then it's going to be part of them. It's going to be their heritage, and then it will survive as well. Because we actually do things which we find nice and beneficial. When you talk about the general plan development, then we are being told that give us freedom to do what we want, then we give us green field, and then we have investors and local areas will develop. I do not really believe that, because this kind of freedom, which is not hindered by anything, doesn't exist, because people have been here before us and will be after us. So these are the two things which are given, and they restrict the environment where we operate. And freedom in common goods is destructive, because all the parties will then follow their own self-interest. And there's been criticism to this theory, but I think that in communities we have to agree. Would it be through general plan development or heritage foundation protection? How exactly do we define public interest, and what are the conditions set for survival? Even if we can't agree, in organizations, if we cannot agree on common values, it doesn't mean that the values do not exist. The question is that whose values are being dominant. And if we do not determine public interest, then it leaves room only for business interest. But nobody wants to live in an environment which is in the hands of the developers' ambitions. We want to live in an environment where we can find ourselves, and the community sees themselves. And again, why is it so important? Because if you don't care neglect leads to destruction, because in Estonia we have seen it many times where the destruction of a cultural heritage is a trauma for the community. And trauma because it will leave an imprint, how we're going to talk about a place, what we're going to say, and what are the opinions. Unfortunately, there are many examples, and some of them have been initiated by the state or the government level. It would be the local government or some institutions. So this is something we definitely want to avoid, so that we see the disappearance of cultural heritage. And to summarize all these wise words, so what is important? It is important to plan for the integral living environment and looking at the diversity and integrity across timelines. So we have the past, the present, and the future, all the layers. And the heritage survives the best if it's in use. And this is in Heritage Foundation. What we try to do is that we want to make sure that these buildings are put into use or they're being reused. So this is the big objective of the Norwegian program. So in 7 old towns, we can put a building back into use and guarantee its continuous use. So I would like to thank our Norwegian colleagues and sponsors so that this possibility exists. Because we do things in life which are presumed to be beneficial. So because things are beneficial are in use. So we try to do that with the historical city centers. Because cultural heritage is not a renewable resource. We can only do prevention. And prevention first means that we look after our property. Things don't fall apart because that they're old, but because they are neglected and they have not been prepared for years or even hundreds of years, because then we call them ruins. Because there are some ruins next to us here as well. And we're not going to do any development here. But if you maintain, you don't have to restore. Then it's a question if you're going to be reconstruct, repair, or rebuild. Because if you care for the cultural heritage, is what I consider important. And once again, we talk about a physical environment and certain parameters. And as it has been, the examples of last weeks are from Viljandi or Haapsalu, then we can see that there are certain cultural aspects which has become part of the living memory, and the identity of the local population are even more important than physical parameters. So that means that we can, when we're developing our environment, we should not forget that we are all part of the culture, and we prefer more culture to less culture. We prefer these environments where we can imagine ourselves in the future, and part of it is related to the past. So we don't live only in today. And I suppose we don't want to live only in today, because we want to feel that we are part of their timeline. So I suppose that it wasn't not really optimistic, but it's an introduction to the rest of the day. And this is what we do on a daily basis. But if we look at the environments, the old towns, but part of this project, then because of this financing, we can now think about all the issues before us, and then we can also work to make sure that some buildings will be put back into use. We can gather information about the historical city centers and to also disseminate this information, because some of this information is conferences, print materials, raising awareness of what we have and what has really reached us. So thank you very much for your attention, and good luck today.